The village of Mizuho lay nestled between mist-cloaked hills, its cobbled streets still slick from the dawn rain, the air thick with the earthy scent of wet pine, and the faint, clean aroma of fresh tatami mats drifting from open doorways. The ronin moved through the quiet lanes with measured steps, the rhythmic clatter of his weathered geta echoing softly against the stone, a sound both familiar and lonely. His hands, calloused and veined, rested lightly on the worn hilt of his katana, its presence a constant weight, both comfort and condemnation. The sword had once sung in his grip, a creature of lethal grace. Now it sat mute, its edge untested as the years dulled not just the steel, but the man who carried it. The scent of bitter green tea wafted from a nearby tea house, mingling with the crisp morning air, and for a fleeting moment, he remembered another life. The quiet hum of a monastery before dawn, the slow ceremony of pouring tea, the way steam curled like the smoke of long-extinguished battle fires. His breath hitched slightly, a tremor passing through his fingers before he stilled them. Control, he reminded himself. Control is all that remains. The village bustled softly around him, oblivious to the storm within him, the butcher's blade thudding against wood, the laughter of children chasing a wooden hoop, the distant chant of a priest cleansing the shrine steps. He paused beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient cherry tree, its blossoms long fallen, and closed his eyes. The wind carried the salt-sweat tang of the river, the murmur of leaves, the faintest metallic whisper as his katana shifted in its saya, a sound like a ghost sighing. Memories pressed against the backs of his eyelids, the betrayal he could not stop, the comrades whose names he no longer deserved to speak, the crimson spill of dusk on a battlefield where honor had bled out long before the fighting ended. His chest ached with the old shame, a not no amount of breath could loosen. Yet here, in the fragile quiet, he could almost taste the phantom tranquility. He sought the crisp bitterness of tea on his tongue, the cool smoothness of meditation beads between his fingers, the way dawn light once gilded the practice yard as he moved through forms now half forgotten. A sparrow alighted on the cobbles nearby, cocking its head as if studying him. Even the birds know, he thought wryly, even they see the shadow trailing you. But then the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain-soaked moss and polished wood from the village shrine, and for a heartbeat, the weight lifted. The gods were silent, but the world was not. The river still flowed. The cherry tree would bloom again. And perhaps so too could a man, if he had the courage to kneel in the dust, to breathe, to begin anew. The ronin opened his eyes, squared his shoulders, and walked on. The villagers' whispers trailed after him like ghostly fingers, their voices mingling with the evening wind that carried the faint scent of sakura blossoms past their prime. The ronin trod the cobbled path, his weathered geta clattering a quiet, uneven rhythm, betraying the limp he refused to acknowledge. Inside the dim tea house, the air was heavy with the clean, sun-baked aroma of fresh tatami, and the bitter perfume of green tea. Steam curling in slow spirals from a chipped earthenware cup. He knelt, the silk of his frayed hakama whispering against the polished wood floor. His hands once steady as the mountains hovering briefly over the low table. Fingers trembling like scattered leaves in a storm's wake. The sound of a distant sword being drawn, a hiss like winter's first breath, echoed in his memory. And he inhaled sharply, the sting of iron and blood flooding his senses though the room was silent. Shadows stretched long across the walls, painted in the dying light of dusk. And for a moment, he was not a broken wanderer, but the man who had stood unyielding before the lords of the north, whose name had been spoken with reverence in the halls of shoguns. But then the vision shattered, replaced by the hollow pit in his chest, the weight of every failure pressing down like rain-sodden earth upon a grave. The tea cooled before him, its surface still as a frozen pond, mirroring the stillness he could never find within. Outside, a lone cicada sang its twilight dirge, a rhythm older than the gods themselves, and he wondered if redemption, too, was an ancient thing, just beyond the reach of mortal hands. His fingers curled around the cup, warmth seeping into his calloused skin, and he closed his eyes, chasing the phantom taste of bitter herbs and forgotten vows. The villagers' words clung to him, not as praise, but as thorns. He was mighty once. Now, the only battle left was against the ghosts in his breath, the hesitation in his draw, the way his soul flinched at the memory of fire and screaming. The tea was cold when he drank it, and the bitterness lingered, as it always did. The evening air hung thick, with the nostalgic scent of damp earth and pine. The last embers of daylight fading behind the silhouettes of cedar trees, as the ronin knelt on the weathered engawa of the abandoned shrine. Beneath him, the tatami exhaled the faint aroma of straw and thyme, mingling with the sharp, grassy scent of freshly whisked matcha, its bitterness lingering on his tongue like the regrets he could never swallow. A firefly blinked into existence beside him, its light frail yet defiant against the gathering dark, and for a breath, his calloused fingers stilled above the chipped teacup. The creature's glow pulsed in time with the throbbing ache in his ribs, where old wounds whispered of battles lost, of names struck from scrolls, of a blade that had once sung for justice, but now rested silent in its scabbard. He exhaled slowly, watching the steam from his tea curl like incense toward the shrine's moss-caked torii, and wondered if the gods still lingered in such forgotten places, if they too turned their faces from men who had faltered. The firefly drifted closer, its wings brushing the knotted silk of his frayed hakama, and in its fragile dance, he saw the ghost of his own restless spirit, fleeting, unmoored, yet stubbornly alight. The distant clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed like the footsteps of his departed comrades, and the weight of his tanto cool against his thigh seemed to grow heavier. A silent question, Could a man reclaim honor when his past had crumbled like autumn leaves beneath winter's first frost? The insect's glow flickered again, casting trembling shadows over his scarred hands, and for a moment, the shame that coiled in his chest loosened. Here, in the hush between dusk and night, where the cicada's drone melted into the rustle of bamboo, he imagined the firefly was a soul, perhaps his own learning to breathe anew. The tea had gone cold. He drank it anyway, the bitterness now a sacrament. Somewhere beyond the torii, a katana sang as it was drawn, its whisper a promise or a warning he could no longer tell. But the firefly lingered, a tiny beacon in the vast, indifferent dark. And as the stars blinked awake one by one, the ronin closed his eyes and inhaled, filling his lungs with the quiet resolve of the night. The air in the small, dimly lit chamber was heavy with the clean scent of fresh tatami, its woven reeds releasing a faint, earthy sweetness that mingled with the sharp aroma of bitter green tea steam curling from the chowan like the ghosts of his regrets. The ronin knelt, his calloused hands resting on his thighs, fingers trembling imperceptibly as the weight of his dishonor pressed upon him. A silent avalanche of shame that had followed him through countless sleepless nights and nameless villages. Outside, the wind whispered through the bamboo grooves, a murmur as delicate as the memory of his once proud name, now lost to the indifferent march of time. The polished wood beneath him felt cool and smooth, a fleeting comfort as he inhaled deeply, the breath shuddering slightly in his chest not from fear, but from the solemn clarity of resolve. His katana lay before him, its scabbard black as a moonless night, the edge within a whispered promise of release. With a slow, deliberate motion, he drew it, the blade sighing free with a sound like winter cutting through autumn's last leaf, a sound he had heard 1,000 times in battle. Yet now it carried the weight of finality. The steel caught the faint light of the lone candle, flickering like the fragile hope that had once burned in his heart before defeat had drowned it. He had failed his lord, his comrades, himself. Their faces surfaced in his mind, not as accusations, but as silent witnesses to this last act of defiance against disgrace. The rituals of Seppuku were as ancient as the land itself, a bridge between the mortal and the divine, a surrender to the gods who had long abandoned him, or so he had believed. Yet here, in this quiet space where time stretched thin, he sensed the turning of the great wheel, the endless cycle of falling and rising that governed even the cherry blossoms, brief in their glory but eternal in their return. His fingers tightened around the tsuka, knuckles whitening as he steadied himself, the tremor in his hands stilling at last. The bitterness of incense seeped into the air, mingling with the iron tang of anticipation. Or was it the memory of blood spilled in vain? He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the chaotic clamor of the world outside the distant clatter of geta on cobbled streets, the laughter of merchants unaware of his existence faded into stillness. This was not despair. This was the final discipline, the mastery of accepting what could not be undone. The blade's kiss would be cold, but the peace beyond it, perhaps, would be warmer than life had been. And so, with the weight of centuries of warriors who had walked this path before him, he bowed his head, not in submission, but in reverence to the honor he had lost, to the honor he might yet reclaim. The ronin knelt on the sun-warmed tatami, the clean, grassy scent of the woven mats mingling with the earthy bitterness of freshly whisked matcha beside him. The late afternoon light slanted through the shoji screens, painting the room in gold and shadow, dust motes swirling like forgotten spirits in the stillness. His hands, calloused and scarred, moved with deliberate care as he unwrapped the cloth from his ancestral wakizashi, its blade dulled by neglect, yet still bearing the faint, ghostly sheen of its former glory. The polished saya, smooth as a river stone, chilled his fingertips as he drew the blade, the sound a whisper, a sigh of steel against wood, so quiet it might have been the wind slipping through the pines outside. His breath hitched just slightly as the edge caught the light, and for a moment he saw not the tarnished metal, but the past reflected in its surface. The battlefields where he had once been fearless, the faces of those he could not save, the weight of his own arrogance that had led him to ruin. The tremor in his fingers betrayed him then, a fleeting weakness that echoed the fractures in his spirit. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs like a retreating tide, and dipped the cloth into the oil, its sharp, pungent scent cutting through the haze of memory. Each stroke of the rag was a ritual, a silent prayer to the gods of blade and forge, to the ancestors who had carried this steel before him. The rhythm steadied him, the gentle scrape of cloth on metal, the creak of his joints, the distant clatter of geta on cobbled streets as the world outside moved on, unburdened by his shame. Outside, a sparrow alighted on the engawa, its tiny claws scritching against the wood, a reminder of life's fragile persistence. He paused, feeling the warmth of the fading sun on his back, and wondered if redemption, like the blade in his hands, could be honed anew with patience, if the stains of failure could be polished away like tarnish. The tea grew cold, its steam long vanished, but the bitterness would remain just as the past did, inescapable. Yet in this quiet, in the disciplined repetition of motion, in the way the light shifted as the day surrendered to dusk, there was a semblance of peace. Not absolution, not yet, but the faintest glimmer of it, like the first star trembling in the twilight. The scent of fresh tatami clean straw and sun-warmed earth drifted through the quiet room as the ronin knelt before the low writing desk. The smooth, cool wood beneath his fingertips, a fleeting anchor. Ink spread across the parchment in careful, deliberate strokes, each character a whispered confession, each line a weight lifted and replaced by another. The bitterness of green tea lingered on his tongue, a taste both familiar and mournful, like the memories of a life once lived with honor. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets echoed distant laughter, a world moving on while he remained suspended in the stillness of his guilt. The lantern's flame flickered, casting shadows that trembled as his hand did a tremor he could not suppress, a body betraying the storm within. He paused, exhaling slowly, the breath a ritual unto itself, as if he could expel the shame coiled in his chest like a serpent. The sound of his blade being drawn, a whisper of steel against silk, played again in his mind, the ghost of a movement he had performed 1,000 times. Yet now it haunted him like a debt unpaid. The village elder's name appeared beneath his brush, the ink dark as dried blood, and for a moment he saw not the parchment but the faces of those he'd failed. Comrades vanished into the smoke of battle, the lord whose trust he'd shattered, the quiet, accusing eyes of the peasant girl whose family he could not save. The wind slipped through the shoji screen, carrying the faintest chill of autumn's approach, a reminder of cycles unbroken, of seasons changing, while he remained torn between the past and the precipice of redemption. His grip tightened not in anger, but in resolve. This letter was no plea for mercy. It was a bridge, fragile as dawn's first light, spanning the chasm between disgrace and the faint, stubborn hope that mastery of blade, of self might yet bring peace. The ink dried, the brush stilled, and in the silence he wondered if the gods, weary as they must be of wayward souls, would hear the unspoken vow beneath his words. Forgive me, or do not. But let this be the last failure I carry. The elder studied the ronin's face creased with years of wind and war, shadowed beneath the low light of the swaying paper lantern before nodding once. A slow dip of his chin that carried the weight of centuries. The air between them was thick with the scent of fresh tatami, its clean, grassy aroma mingling with the bitter steam of matcha, stirred to a quiet froth. Outside, the last of the evening rain dripped from the eaves in uneven whispers, punctuated by the distant clatter of wooden geta on cobblestone as the world moved on, careless of the moment's gravity. The ronin's fingers, curled against his knees, betrayed the faintest tremor not from fear, but from the memory of another Tarum long ago, where his name had once been spoken with reverence instead of pity. The elder's voice, when it came, was like the slide of a blade from its saya, deliberate, honed, barely audible above the rustle of silk as he shifted. To enter this path is to stand before the gods with your failures in your hands, he said, the words settling like dust on a battlefield, the weight of them pressed against the ronin's ribs, sudden and suffocating. He inhaled, slow, tasting the iron-sharp tang of the coming storm through the open shoji, feeling the ghost of every cut he'd landed in anger, every life taken without the stillness of a true strike. The lacquered wood beneath his palm was cool as a river stone, smooth as a skull polished by time. How many before him had knelt here, hollowed out by shame, seeking peace in the smothering dark of discipline. The elder's eyes, black as pooled ink, held no judgment, only the patient stillness of a shrine gate flanked by pines. A flash of memory, his own master's voice, long swallowed by fire, murmuring that mastery was surrender, that the sword's song was born of silence. The lantern flickered a moth's wings brushing the flame, and for a breath, the ronin felt the unbearable lightness of the blade he no longer deserved to wield. Balanced between the ruins of his past and the terrible, whispering hope of absolution, with the deliberate care of a man reassembling a shattered scroll, he bowed, his forehead hovering an inch above the floor, close enough to smell the earth beneath the mats, the damp promise of renewal. The elder exhaled a sound like wind through a canyon, and in that sound the ronin heard the turning of the heavens, the slow, inevitable grind of stone against stone, of history forgiving nothing. And yet, permission had been given. The first step awaited. As the last amber light of dusk bled into the indigo embrace of night, the ronin made his way to the secluded grove, his geta clattering like a slow, solemn heartbeat against the moss-strewn cobbles. The air was thick with the damp earthiness of impending rain, mingling with the sharp, clean scent of pine needles crushed beneath his feet. A whisper of wind stirred the bamboo beyond the torii gate, its hollow creaking a mournful counterpoint to the distant chirrup of crickets nature's monks chanting vespers. He knelt on the worn tatami mat, its familiar musty sweetness weaving with the grassy tang of freshly whisked matcha beside him, steam curling like the ghosts of his regrets. The shink of his katana leaving its saya was barely audible, yet it split the silence like a blade through silk, the steel catching the flicker of fireflies as he laid it before him, its curve a frozen moon against the dark wood. His calloused fingers trembled ever so slightly as they hovered above the hilt, the same fingers that had once been steady enough to thread a needle in a typhoon, now betraying him like the pupils who had fled his dojo when his star dimmed. The weight of his failures pressed harder than any armor. The lord he'd failed to protect, the duel he'd walked away from, the name that now meant nothing. He inhaled, slow and deliberate, the chill of the evening seeping into his lungs, and closed his eyes. The past surged like a rogue wave the screams of battle, the sticky warmth of blood on his cheek. The way the cherry blossoms had fallen that morning, indifferent to the corpses beneath them. Transience, the monks had taught him, all glory is petals on the water. Yet his soul still clawed for something to endure. A droplet struck the blade rain or tears, he couldn't tell, and in that shimmering distortion, he glimpsed the boy he'd been, kneeling just like this beneath his master's gaze, heart brimming with dreams as bright as the polished gleam of the sword before him now. The wind stilled. The fireflies paused. For a breath, the universe held its own, waiting. Then the cicadas erupted in crescendo, the rain began in earnest, and the ronin exhaled, his shoulders settling like stones into a riverbed. Honor was not a banner to reclaim, but a path to walk one step, one breath, one drop joining the stream. The tea, gone cold, tasted of bitterness and the faintest hint of sweetness beneath. He drank it anyway, the scent of freshly woven tatami clean, earthy, like sun-baked straw filled the dim chamber as the ronin knelt, his calloused hands resting on his thighs. A single shaft of pale morning light cut through the shoji screen, dust motes swirling like forgotten battles in its glow, the sharp, whispered suki of his katana being drawn a finger's width from its saya echoed in the stillness, a sound as familiar as his own breath. Yet heavy now, with the weight of every life it had taken, his fingers trembled ever so slightly against the lacquered scabbard, as if the ghosts of his past clung to him, their cold whispers threading through his marrow. He closed his eyes, the bitterness of matcha still lingering on his tongue from the morning ritual, its astringency a mirror to the regret coiled in his chest. Memories surfaced, unbidden the crimson spray of dawn battles, the guttural cries of fallen comrades, the sickening crunch of his own failure when the daimyo's banner had fallen, torn by his hesitation. The cool silk of his torn kimono brushed his skin, a wretched contrast to the sweat-slicked fury of that day, when honor had slipped through his fingers like sand. Outside, the rhythmic karankoran of wooden geta on cobblestones wove through the murmur of the waking town, a world moving on while he remained trapped in the stillness of his shame. He inhaled deeply incense and damp autumn air, the faint metallic tang of the blade before him, and exhaled as if he could expel the decades of ghosts. In the silence between heartbeats, he imagined the cut, swift, clean, a single stroke to sever the thread of his unraveled legacy. Yet, beneath the despair, something older stirred the memory of his master's voice, low as distant thunder. The sword is not the hand, nor the hand the soul. The light shifted. A sparrow alighted on the porch, its head tilting as if in question. His breath stilled. Honor was not in the dying, but in the bearing. The blade slid home with a muted click, and for the first time in years, his hands did not shake. The morning air carried the faint scent of dew-damp earth through the shoji screen, mingling with the clean, sun-warmed straw of the tatami beneath his knees. The ronin exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his breath as it left him heavy with the silence of years, of roads walked alone, of names now unspoken. Before him, the unfinished altar stood, bare, solid wood, its grain like the lines of an old map. His hands, calloused and trembling ever so slightly, not from age, but from the memory of failures etched into his flesh, lifted the katana from its worn saya. The blade hissed free, a sound so sharp it seemed to cut the stillness, and for a heartbeat, the room held its breath with him. He remembered the last time it had tasted battle, how the steel had sung, how the autumn leaves had fallen red as the shame that followed. Now he laid it upon the altar, the metal cool against the wood, its edge catching the pale light like a whispered promise. From a folded cloth, he took a stick of incense, its fragrance unspooling even before he lit it sandalwood and something softer, like the ghost of cherry blossoms from a courtyard he'd once known. The flame trembled in his grip before touching the tip. Smoke curled upward, a sinuous thread weaving between worlds. He watched it rise, thick and sweet, as memories pressed in. The clatter of geta on cobblestones as he fled a battle he shouldn't have won. The bitter tang of green tea drunk in a dingy roadside tavern. The way the silk of his torn hayori had felt slipping through his fingers like time itself. The incense ash grew longer, precarious, yet the smoke never wavered. It drifted past the sword, past the small cup of water placed for the gods who had long seemed deaf to his curses. And for a moment, he wondered if they would listen to this fragile offering, this fragile man. Outside, a wind stirred, carrying the distant murmur of a stream, the lazy croak of a frog. The world moved on, indifferent. But here, in this quiet space, the ronin closed his eyes. The scent of incense filled his lungs, replacing the iron stink of old blood, the acrid sweat of fear. His fingertips brushed the sword's tsuka, tracing the worn silk where his grip had once been sure. Honor was not a thing reclaimed. He realized not a blade reforged, but a broken vase mended with gold. The cracks would remain. The weight would never leave. Yet as the smoke thinned, as the light shifted across the floor in slow, patient strokes, something unknotted in his chest. The altar was simple. The offering was meager. But the act, slow, deliberate, imperfect, felt like the first true cut of a path he could walk without flinching. The gods might not answer. The past would not forgive. But here now, with the scent of wood and incense wrapping around him like a faded banner, the ronin bowed his head and began again. The ronin knelt in the dim, hushed space of the dojo, where the scent of freshly woven tatami mingled with the earthiness of steamed green tea. Bitter on his tongue as he sipped, the air was still, damp from the evening's rain, clinging to his skin like the weight of his past. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones faded into the distance, leaving only the whisper of wind through bamboo. He exhaled slowly, his calloused fingers resting on the cold, polished wood of his sheathed katana, its presence a silent judge, a relic of battles won and honors lost. His breath hitched just slightly as a tremor passed through his hand, a fleeting betrayal of the calm he so desperately sought. Memories surged unbidden. The sting of betrayal, the screams of fallen comrades, the ashes of a village he had failed to protect. His jaw tightened. But then there, in the gathering dusk, a single firefly alighted on the sword's hilt, its fragile light pulsing like a heartbeat. He stilled, mesmerized by its glow, so delicate yet unyielding in the dark. Was it a sign from the kami, a mockery, or simply a creature drawn to the warmth of his lingering shame? The firefly lingered, its wings trembling as if in understanding. And for a moment, the ronin dared to hope that even he, a blade rusted by time and regret, might still reflect the light. The moment stretched, thin as silk, until with a quiet breath, he released his grip on the past and let the firefly drift away, carrying with it the faintest ember of forgiveness. The ronin knelt before the weathered altar, the scent of aged cedar and faint incense lingering in the quiet air, mingling with the cleaner, fresher aroma of newly laid tatami beneath his knees. His calloused hands, marked by decades of sword and strife, trembled slightly as they settled onto his thighs, a tremor so slight none but the gods might notice. Yet to him, it was proof of the storm still churning within. The polished wood of the shrine felt cool beneath his fingertips, its smooth grain a silent testament to generations of devotion, a stark contrast to the ragged edges of his own spirit. Outside, the last light of dusk filtered through the paper shoji, painting the room in hues of amber and shadow, while somewhere beyond the courtyard, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed like the distant heartbeat of a world that had long since moved on without him. He closed his eyes, drawing in a slow breath through his nose, the air crisp with the approach of evening, carrying the faint bitterness of green tea still warming on a low table nearby. In that stillness, the past rushed in unbidden, the metallic tang of blood on snow, the keening cry of a blade drawn too late, the weight of a name once spoken with reverence, now sullied by his failures. His jaw tightened, muscles coiled like a bowstring, until the sharp, papery rustle of a leaf skittering across the courtyard broke the spell. With deliberate care, he uncurled his fists, pressing his palms flat against his knees, grounding himself in the present. The act was simple, yet it carried the weight of sacrament, each movement a silent plea for absolution, each breath a step closer to the mastery that had eluded him. The tea's aroma deepened, a reminder of the monk's words earlier that day. The bitter cup cleanses as it chastens. He had scoffed then, but now, kneeling in the gathering dark, he understood. Honor was not a thing to be reclaimed like a lost coin, but woven anew with every mindful gesture. Every moment of stillness wrested from the chaos of memory. The candle flame flickered, casting shifting patterns across the altar's worn surface, and in its dance, he glimpsed the eternal cycle, ash to ember, ember to light. For the first time in years, his exhale carried something softer than grief. Perhaps not yet peace, but the possibility of it. The night air hung still, heavy with the scent of dew-damp earth, and the faint, woody aroma of tatami mats from the open shoji behind him. The ronin knelt at the edge of the engawa, his calloused hands resting on his thighs, the rough weave of his hakama whispering against the smooth cedar planks. The moon, a silver sliver cradled by the inky sky, cast a fragile light over the blade laid across his lap, his last tether to the man he had once been. The sword saya, polished to a muted sheen, felt cool beneath his trembling fingers, the lacquer smooth as the river stones he had skipped as a boy, before the wars, before the names he could no longer bear to hear. With a breath that shuddered like wind through bamboo, he drew the katana, the sound a single, crystalline note shink so sharp it seemed to sever the night itself. The blade caught the moonlight, glinting like ice, and for a heartbeat, he saw not the steel but the faces of those he had failed, the Lord whose trust he'd broken, the disciple who had fallen beside him, the village left to ashes because he had been too slow, too proud, too weak. His grip tightened, knuckles blanching, but then a breath. A pause, the scent of green tea, bitter and faint, wafted from the cup beside him, its steam curling like the ghosts of his regrets. He exhaled, long and slow, feeling the weight of the sword not as a burden, but as an extension of his own sinew and bone, a relic of the discipline he had once worn as easily as his now frayed kimono. Outside, the rhythmic clack-clack of geta on cobblestones echoed some night traveler, some soul still tethered to the world's ceaseless motion. But here, in this moment, time stretched thin as rice paper. The wind stirred, carrying the distant chime of a temple bell, its resonance humming through him like a reminder of the harmony he had lost. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, he felt the sword's balance, its terrible beauty, its promise of either redemption or ruin. The crickets sang their endless song. The leaves rustled like the whispers of ancestors. And then, with a motion as deliberate as the turning of the seasons, he lifted the blade, its edge kissing the moonlight once more, not in anger, not in despair, but in the first, fragile step toward stillness, toward the mastery that had always been and would always be the only path home. The firefly's glow pulsed like a hesitant heartbeat in the twilight, its fragile light brushing against the ronin's weathered face as he knelt on the tatami. The clean scent of straw and aged wood grounding him, even as his mind threatened to unravel. The room was hushed, save for the whisper of his own breath and the distant, rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones, outside a world moving on without him. His hands, once steadied by the certainty of purpose, trembled slightly as they rested on his knees, the calloused fingers tracing ghosts of old sword grips. The bitterness of matcha lingered on his tongue, a taste as familiar as failure, its astringency a cruel mirror to the regrets coiled in his chest. Memories flickered like shadows. The last dawn he had faced his doomed lord, the way the mist had clung to the battlefield like a shroud, the silence that followed the final, dishonorable retreat. Now, here, in this quiet alcove of the world, the past was a blade he could neither sheathe nor wield. The firelight, no, the firefly's light deepened, casting his lined face in an ethereal glow, as if the spirits themselves leaned close to witness his reckoning. The air was cool, carrying the faintest tremor of incense, of pine from the distant mountains, of the inevitable turn of seasons. He inhaled slowly, the way his old master had taught him, each breath a sutra, each exhalation a release, but the weight of his disgrace sat heavy in his lungs. The katana beside him hummed with silent tension, its polished scabbard smooth under his fingertips, a promise and a condemnation. Was this the moment? The firefly's light swelled, a tiny sun in the gathering dark, and for a heartbeat, he dared to hope it was not just an insect, but a kami's gaze, a fragment of the divine patience his soul had long ceased to deserve. The poem waited, unspoken in the hollow of his throat. Outside, the wind stirred the cherry blossoms, their petals falling like snow, like the unburied dead. His breath stilled, the light brightened, and in that brilliance, he saw not an end, but a path. The way forward, the way back, the stillness between. Honor was not reclaimed in a single stroke, but in the relentless pursuit of mastery, in the quiet defiance of despair. The firefly drifted upward, its glow fading into the night. And as the shadows reclaimed the room, the ronin bowed his head not in surrender, but in thanks. The ronin knelt in the dim light of the tea house, the quiet scent of fresh tatami mats, and the faint bitterness of matcha curling in the air around him. A fragile peace he dared not disturb. His voice, when he finally spoke, trembled not with age, though time had weathered him, but with the weight of every unspoken failure, every ghost that clung to him like the lingering chill of winter. Each syllable was etched with the memory of blood-soaked earth, of promises shattered like the delicate porcelain cup before him, its cracks golden with repair, but never whole again. The words left him slowly, as if pulled from the depths of some long-sealed tomb, and with them came the phantom sound of steel being drawn, that sharp, almost imperceptible whisper that had once been as familiar to him as his own breath. His fingers, calloused and worn, rested against the smooth lacquer of the sword saya, its cool surface a reminder of discipline, of the mastery he had once claimed, and then lost not on the battlefield, but in the silence of his own unraveling. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets echoed like the steady march of time itself, indifferent to his regrets. He inhaled deeply, the musk of aged wood and silk blending with the faint metallic tang of rain on the wind, and for the briefest moment, he allowed himself to linger in the stillness, in the way the shifting light through the shoji screens painted fleeting shadows, as transient as honor. The tea before him had gone cold, its bitterness now unchecked, and he welcomed it, this small, deliberate suffering. To drink it was to endure, and in enduring, perhaps atone. The gods, if they still watched, would see a man unworthy of forgiveness. But in the tremor of his hands, in the deliberate pause before his next breath, there was something older than shame, the quiet, stubborn defiance of a man who had not yet abandoned the path. The sword at his side was no longer just a weapon. It was the weight of his past, the anchor of his discipline, the last tether to the man he had been before the world had stripped him bare. And when he spoke again, his voice did not shake. The incense had burned low, its faint trail of sandalwood curling into the dawn light that seeped through the shoji screen thin as the veil between regret and redemption. The ronin knelt on the tatami, fingertips pressing into the tightly woven reeds, their clean, grassy scent mingling with the steam of freshly brewed matcha. The bitter green tea sat untouched beside him, its surface a still mirror reflecting his hollowed face, the wrinkles carved by decades of wind and war. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets echoed like the slow beat of a distant drum, a reminder of the world moving on without him. His breath hitched, just slightly, as his calloused hand hovered above the katana's silk-wrapped hilt. The blade whispered as he drew it, a sound so sharp it seemed to cut the air itself. And in that tremor of steel, he heard the echoes of battles long past the cries of men he'd failed, the promises he'd let shatter like brittle autumn leaves underfoot. The polished wood of the shrine floor beneath him felt cool, unforgiving, yet grounding, like the depths of a river that had long since carried his old self away. He closed his eyes, and the weight of his disgrace pressed down, heavier than armor, more suffocating than the thick humidity of midsummer. Yet in the silence between heartbeats, something shifted. The scent of rain on distant pines drifted through the open window, and with it, a memory. His sensei's voice, steady as iron, murmuring that even the mightiest oak bends in the storm, yet does not break. His fingers loosened around the hilt, and his shoulders, once clenched like a fortress gate, eased. The morning sun stretched across the floor, gilding the blade in liquid gold, not the cold, merciless glint of a weapon, but the warm glow of a tool, an extension of a life still capable of shaping its own path. Honor, he realized with a quiet exhale, was not in the grand, bloody finale he'd once imagined, nor in the desperate grasp for a past already lost to time. It was in this, the disciplined stillness of meditation, the deliberate pursuit of mastery, the daily choice to rise and begin again, as the cherry blossoms did each spring, their fleeting beauty a testament to resilience rather than permanence. The tea's bitterness lingered on his tongue, but now it tasted purifying, like the first draft of a poem yet to be perfected. Outside, a sparrow alighted on the courtyard stones, its chirp a soft counterpoint to the distant temple bell, a harmony of impermanence and renewal. And for the first time in years, the ronin breathed freely, his grief no longer a chain, but a river he had learned to cross. The ronin's blade glimmered faintly in the pale morning light, its edge hovering midair like a question, poised between violence and surrender. The scent of fresh tatami mats mingled with the bitter steam of green tea left cooling beside him, the earthy aroma grounding him as the weight of the katana's hilt worn smooth by years of desperate grips thrummed against his calloused palm. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed like the slow beat of a distant drum, a reminder of the world moving on without him, indifferent to his shame. His breath steadied, though his fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer enormity of the choice before him. To cling to the blade that had failed him, or to lay it down and begin again. The sword had been his soul, his curse, the instrument of glory and ruin, alike its steel whispered of battles won and lost, of the crimson spray of autumn clashes, of the way honor had slipped through his fingers like grains of rice scattered in the wind. Yet now, as the monastery's incense curled around him like the ghosts of his past, he felt something unfamiliar. A quiet warmth spreading through his chest, slow as dawn cresting over the mountains. The wood beneath his knees was cool, polished by generations of seekers who had knelt here before him, their own struggles etched into its grain. He remembered his master's voice, long silenced by time. A sword is only as steady as the hand that holds it, and for the first time he understood. The blade descended, not in defeat but in reverence, its tip grazing the floor as his shoulders eased a burden shed, not abandoned. Outside, a sparrow alighted on the courtyard's moss-crowned stone, its chirp delicate against the distant murmur of monks chanting. The tea's bitterness lingered on his tongue, but beneath it was something sweeter, like the first sip after a drought. The silk of his frayed hakama whispered against the tatami as he shifted, the sound harmonizing with the faint rustle of wind through bamboo nature's own meditation. His past failures, once jagged as shattered porcelain, now felt smoothed by time's relentless tide. Honor, he realized, was not a banner to reclaim, but a path to walk anew, step by deliberate step. The sword's reflection in the dim light wavered, then stilled, as though the steel itself had sighed in relief. And as the monastery bell tolled, its deep resonance humming in his bones like the voice of some forgotten god, he closed his eyes, exhaled, and let the weight of the blade dissolve into the weight of peace. The ronin rose from his kneeling position with a slow, deliberate motion, the scent of sun-warmed tatami still clinging to his robes, as if reluctant to release him. His knees protested faintly after hours of stillness, the quiet ache a familiar companion. Around him, the grove exhaled the whisper of leaves settling, the distant patter of a nightingale's wings, the last flicker of the firefly that had hovered near his shoulder, its glow dissolving into the encroaching dark like a dying ember. The air was thick with the mineral tang of damp earth, and the faint, grassy bite of freshly whisked matcha still lingering on his tongue. He flexed his fingers, calloused palms brushing the smooth silk of his obi, and took a breath so deep, it shuddered slightly in his chest, the weight of the past pressing down, as it always did in these moments of quiet. The distant clatter of wooden geta on cobblestones echoed from the village below, a rhythmless cadence of ordinary lives, untouched by the burdens he carried. His own failures haunted him sharper than any blade, the flicker of disbelief in his lord's eyes before the fall, the sickening sound of a body hitting the ground, the silence that followed a silence he'd never escaped. But here, now, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest hint of burning pine from a far-off hearth, and with it came the ghost of clarity. His katana rested against the maple's roots, its scabbard cool beneath his fingertips as he lifted it, the slight rasp of steel against wood a whispered promise. Somewhere beyond the grove, A temple bell tolled, low and resonant, the sound weaving into his pulse, a reminder of the monks who had spoken of cycles, of ruin and renewal, of the way the gods disguised their mercies as trials. The path ahead was shrouded in shadow, but his steps were firmer now, each footfall pressing the weight of the earth beneath him, anchoring him in purpose. The moon, pale as a porcelain cup, cast long fingers of light through the trees, and for the first time in years, he did not flinch from its gaze. Honor was not a thing to be reclaimed like a lost coin, he realized. It was this, the discipline of the breath, the precision of the blade, the stillness between heartbeats. The firefly was gone, but the night was alive with crickets, with wind, with the endless turning of the world. And he walked into it. The next morning, the villagers found the grove untouched, as if the gods themselves had passed through without disturbing a single blade of grass. The air hung heavy with the clean, woody scent of sandalwood incense, its thin tendrils curling like memories refusing to fade. Beneath it lingered the faintest trace of green tea bitter, deliberate steeped long past wisdom, a taste that clung to the back of the throat like regret. The cobbled path leading to the shrine bore no footprints, yet the rhythmic clatter of geta on stone seemed to echo still, a ghostly cadence pacing toward some unseen resolution. Silk banners, once vibrant, now sun-bleached and frayed, stirred in the dawn breeze, their whispered rustle intertwining with the distant cry of a circling hawk, a sound sharp enough to split the sky, yet too fleeting to hold. The ronin had knelt here, in the silence between breaths, his sword laid bare across worn tatami, its blade catching the first light in a way that made it seem molten. The shink of steel being drawn had been softer than a sigh, a sound only the kami could have witnessed. His hands, calloused and trembling not from fear, but from the weight of all they had failed to grasp, had paused above the hilt, fingers hovering as if over an old wound. The polished wood beneath his knees had been cool, smooth as the surface of a still pond, and for a moment he had seen his reflection in it. A face grown gaunt with years of chasing ghosts, eyes dulled by the shame of battles lost not to blades, but to pride. The tea in his cup had gone cold, its bitterness a mirror to the taste of his own name on the wind, once spoken with reverence, now half forgotten, like autumn leaves scattered and trodden into mud. He had inhaled then, slow and deep, as though drawing in the very essence of the grove. The damp earth, the pine resin clinging to the air, the iron tang of dew on moss. The light had shifted, golden and slanting through the trees, painting the world in hues of a past he could neither reclaim nor outrun. Somewhere beyond the shrine, a creek murmured over stone, its endless song a reminder that rivers did not grieve their lost bends. The ronin's exhale had been a vow, uttered not to the gods, but to the silence between them, a promise etched not in words, but in the way his shoulders settled, the way his breath at last found its rhythm with the turning of the earth. And when he rose, The only trace left was the imprint of his knees on the tatami, fading even as the villagers approached. The grove stood unchanged, as if nothing had passed. Yet the wind carried something new, not the scent of incense, nor the echo of steel, but the quiet certainty of a man who had, for the first time in years, met his reflection and sheathed his sword. Years had softened the edges of his once weathered face, but not the memories that lingered like the clean, woody scent of tatami mats beneath his knees. The dojo hummed with quiet reverence, the air thick with the aroma of fresh green tea bitter on his tongue, a taste that always carried him back to another life, another self. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed like distant heartbeats, a reminder of the world moving on while he remained, anchored to the past. His students sat in hushed anticipation, their breath syncing with the whisper of silk as he adjusted his sleeves, the fabric smooth and cool beneath his calloused fingers. They did not see the tremor in his hands as he lifted the teacup, nor the way his chest tightened with the weight of a story he had carried like unspoken penance. The fireflies had returned to the riverbank last evening, their fragile glow like the ghosts of fallen comrades, and as dusk bled into the room, painting the wooden floors in amber, he spoke. "Honor," he began, voice low as the purr of a sheathed blade, "is not a cliff to be scaled, but a flame to be tended." The words unfurled like old wounds, and for a heartbeat, he was young again, kneeling in the ashes of a battle lost, watching the last firefly gutter in his cupped palms. His students leaned closer, their shadows stretching like the long fingers of the pines outside, and he wondered if they could hear the echo of his shame in the silence between his words, could smell the phantom smoke of his failures in the incense curling toward the ceiling. The firefly had lived only a night, yet its light had outlasted empires. He exhaled, slow as the turning of seasons, and let the lesson settle like dust on a blade laid to rest. The past was a blade, too always drawn, always sharp. But here, in the half-light, with the tea cooling and the young ones listening, he could almost believe it was enough to kneel, to breathe, to let the world carry his ghosts away on the sound of the river, endless and forgiving.